Golden child sister got an $80,000 wedding, bankrupted my dad, and tore our family apart. But I finally fought back and... My name's Mike, and I'm 31 now, but this story really starts when I was a kid, growing up in Greenville, Virginia. Our neighborhood was one of those cookie-cutter suburbs, with rows of identical houses, kids playing in the cul-de-sacs, and the faint hum of lawnmowers in the background on Saturday mornings. It was the kind of place that felt calm on the surface, but underneath, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. At least, not in my family. I'm the oldest of 3 siblings. There's Chris, my younger brother, who's 28 now, and Jessica, the baby of the family, who's 24. Being the oldest, I was expected to set the example, help out around the house, and make things easier for my parents. Chris followed in my footsteps, but Jessica? She lived in a completely different world, one where she was untouchable, always Dad's favorite. I don't think it hit me right away. When you're a kid, it's easy to shrug off the small stuff. Dad calling Jessica his little princess was just one of those things. I figured that's how dads were with daughters. Sure, he didn't call me or Chris anything special, but I didn't think much of it at first. Looking back, though, the signs were always there. Take Christmas when I was 13, for example. Chris was 10, and Jessica was 7. We all sat around the tree in our living room, tearing into brightly wrapped gifts while Mom snapped pictures with her old camera. Chris and I got a new gaming console, which we thought was amazing, until we saw what Jessica got. Dad wheeled in this massive dollhouse. It wasn't just any dollhouse either. It had miniature furniture, tiny working lights, and even a little garage for a toy car. Jessica screamed with delight as she unwrapped each matching accessory. Tiny dining sets, a plastic swing set, and even a wardrobe for the dolls. I remember Chris and I sitting there, staring at each other as she jumped up and down. The console we'd gotten was cool, sure, but it was for both of you to share, as Dad put it. Meanwhile, Jessica's haul was all hers, no questions asked. Dad beamed with pride, calling her his little girl and gushing about how much she deserved it. As we got older, the favoritism became impossible to ignore. Jessica didn't just get the best gifts, she got the easiest ride through life. Dad praised her for things that wouldn't have even earned us a pat on the back. I remember one time in middle school when Jessica came home with a most improved certificate for spelling. Dad acted like she'd won an Olympic gold medal. Meanwhile, Chris brought home a trophy from a statewide robotics competition, and all Dad said was, "Nice job," before turning back to his newspaper. I still don't know what was worse, Dad's indifference or the fact that Chris just shrugged it off like he'd expected it. When I turned 16, I got a part-time job bagging groceries at the local supermarket. I wanted to save up for a car, and Dad made it clear I'd have to earn it myself. I didn't mind at first. It felt like a rite of passage. Chris followed in my footsteps a couple of years later, working at a nearby hardware store to save for his own car. Then came Jessica's turn. She turned 16 and didn't get a job. Instead, Dad surprised her with a brand new Volkswagen Jetta. It was shiny, sleek, and miles ahead of the rusty Honda Civic I'd scraped together enough money to buy. When I asked Dad why Jessica didn't have to work for her car, he just waved me off. "She's different," he said. "She needs something reliable. Besides, you boys can handle yourselves. You don't need the same kind of help." It stung, but what could I do? Jessica acted like it was the most natural thing in the world, tossing me a casual "thanks, Daddy," before driving off with her friends. Chris and I laughed it off later, calling her the queen, but there was a bitterness behind the jokes we didn't talk about. By the time I graduated high school, I couldn't wait to leave. I got into a college a few hours away in Richmond, and moving out felt like escaping a shadow I'd been living under for years. Chris stayed behind for another year before heading out to Seattle for school. Jessica, on the other hand, never left home. Dad made sure she didn't have to. Jessica breezed through her teenage years without ever holding a job or worrying about bills. Dad took care of everything, from her gas money to her college tuition. Meanwhile, Chris and I were on our own, juggling school and part-time jobs to make ends meet. Even now, years later, not much has changed. I live in Richmond and work as a graphic designer. Chris is thriving in Seattle as a software engineer. Jessica, though, she's still living at home, completely dependent on Dad. She doesn't work, doesn't pay rent, and doesn't seem in any hurry to change that. Dad's still her biggest cheerleader, too. Whenever I visit, he talks about her like she's some kind of prodigy. She just needs time to find her path, he says. She's special, Mike. You'll see. Special. That word grates on me more than I care to admit. I don't know what's so special about lounging around the house while someone else foots the bill. Chris feels the same way. We've joked about it over the years, but the jokes have lost their humor. Jessica, of course, doesn't see the problem. She acts like her life is perfectly normal, like it's completely reasonable for a 24-year-old to rely on her parents for everything. And Dad? He enables it, refusing to hold her to the same standards he held us to. It's not like I want her to struggle. She's my sister, and I love her in my own way. But growing up in the shadow of someone else's pedestal does something to you. It leaves a mark. Looking back, I used to think Dad's favoritism was just a phase, something Jessica would outgrow as she got older. But now I know better. This wasn't a phase. It was the foundation. And no matter how far Chris and I have tried to move past it, that foundation still shapes everything between us. It was a Saturday afternoon when Jessica dropped the news. I was at my apartment in Richmond, catching up on some freelance work, when my phone buzzed with a text. It was from her. Big announcement at dinner tonight. You have to come. I stared at the message for a moment, debating whether I should even bother. Family dinners had become an exhausting routine. Jessica soaking up attention, Dad fawning over her, and Mom sitting quietly on the sidelines while Chris and I tried not to roll our eyes too much. But curiosity got the better of me. I cleared my evening and made the hour-long drive back to Greenville. When I arrived, Jessica greeted me at the door, practically vibrating with excitement. Mike, you're going to freak out, she squealed, grabbing my arm and dragging me into the house. The living room was already packed with relatives. Mom was in the kitchen, setting out appetizers, while Dad poured drinks and laughed loudly at something one of my uncles had said. Jessica's boyfriend, Brian, stood awkwardly near the fireplace, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. When everyone was settled around the dinner table, Jessica tapped her glass with a fork, grinning like she'd just won the lottery. So, she began, her voice dripping with theatrical flair. I have some big news to share. I glanced at Chris, who had flown in from Seattle for the weekend. He raised an eyebrow, already bracing for whatever drama was about to unfold. Jessica held up her left hand, and there it was, a diamond ring, glittering under the chandelier. Brian and I are engaged, she announced, stretching the word engaged like she was savoring every syllable. The room erupted into cheers and congratulations. Mom teared up, Dad hugged her like she just graduated from medical school, and even Brian managed a small smile despite looking like a deer caught in headlights. Chris and I joined in with polite smiles and half-hearted claps. It wasn't that we weren't happy for her, we were, but we both knew what this meant. Jessica's engagement wasn't just a family milestone. It was the start of what would inevitably become a months-long spectacle, with Dad footing the bill for everything. Sure enough, the conversation quickly shifted to wedding planning. Jessica wasted no time diving into her vision. I'm thinking something big. Like, really big, she said, her hands moving animatedly as she talked. There's this amazing estate in Charlottesville I've been eyeing. It's perfect. And I want a live band, not a DJ. Oh, and fireworks. Imagine ending the night with fireworks over the lake. Dad's smile widened with every word. That sounds incredible, sweetheart, he said. We'll make it happen. I nearly choked on my drink. Chris shot me a look, his expression screaming, here we go. Then Jessica dropped the bomb. It'll only be around $80,000, give or take, she said casually, as if she were discussing the price of a new blender. She turned to Dad, flashing him her most charming smile. You'll take care of it, right? I expected him to laugh it off, maybe tell her that kind of money was out of the question. But instead, he hesitated for just a moment before nodding. Of course, princess, he said. Anything for you. I felt my jaw tighten. Chris's face had gone completely blank, the kind of expression he used when he was trying not to explode. Later that night, after most of the relatives had gone home, Chris and I cornered Dad in the kitchen. $80,000? Chris asked, keeping his voice low but firm. Are you serious? That's an insane amount of money for a wedding. Dad shrugged, pouring himself another drink. It's her wedding. She deserves the best, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And what about us? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Chris and I didn't get anything close to that kind of support. We've been on our own since we left home. How is this fair? Dad sighed, setting his glass down on the counter. You boys are independent. You've always been able to take care of yourselves. Jessica's different. She needs more help. Chris let out a short, humorless laugh. Different? She's 24 and hasn't worked a day in her life. Of course she needs help. She's never had to do anything for herself. Dad's eyes narrowed, his tone turning defensive. This isn't about you two. It's about family, supporting each other. If you can't see that, maybe you're the ones with the problem. I felt the frustration boiling over but forced myself to stay calm. We're not saying you can't help her, I said. But 80 grand? That's more than just support. That's ridiculous. And it's not just about the money. It's the principle. Dad waved me off, turning to leave the room. It's my money, he said over his shoulder. I'll spend it how I see fit. Chris and I didn't bother trying to argue further. It was clear we weren't going to change his mind. The next day, as we drove back to Richmond, Chris vented in the passenger seat. He's going to ruin himself over this wedding, he said, shaking his head. You know that, right? And we're going to be the bad guys for pointing it out. He wasn't wrong. Jessica's ability to play the victim was practically an art form, and Dad never hesitated to take her side. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something worse. Chris stayed for one more day before flying back to Seattle, and I tried to get back to my normal routine. But the memory of that dinner kept replaying in my head, the weight of Dad's words sitting heavy in my chest. It's my money. Sure, it was his money. But at what cost? Deep down, I knew Chris was right. This wasn't going to end well. The engagement announcement had barely settled before Jessica's wedding plans kicked into high gear. Within days, my phone started buzzing with updates. Links to venues, dress designs, and catering options, all sent to the family group chat with captions like, "Isn't this perfect?" Or, "Daddy, look at this." I muted the chat after the third notification. I already knew how this would go. Dad would say yes to everything. Jessica would play the role of a grateful daughter while making endless demands, and Chris and I would sit on the sidelines, shaking our heads at the absurdity of it all. A week later, I decided to drop by Mom and Dad's house to check in. It was supposed to be a quick visit, but as soon as I walked in, I realized things had escalated far beyond what I'd expected. Jessica was in the living room, surrounded by stacks of wedding magazines and samples. Swatches of fabric, floral arrangement catalogs, and guest list templates were strewn across the coffee table. She was on the phone, speaking in an exaggeratedly sweet tone. "Yes, Daddy will cover it," she said, twirling a lock of her hair. "No, it's not a problem. He promised this would be perfect." Dad was sitting nearby, nodding along as if the financial avalanche Jessica was planning didn't faze him. "Hey, Mike," Jessica said, noticing me for the first time. "Isn't this exciting? I've got appointments lined up all week. Wedding planners, dress fittings, venue tours, you name it." I forced a smile. "Sounds busy." "Busy is an understatement," she said with a dramatic sigh. "But it'll all be worth it. This wedding is going to be the event of the year." Dad chuckled, reaching for his coffee. "That's my girl. Nothing but the best for her." The words felt like a slap. I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to point out how Chris and I had to scrape together every dollar to fund our own milestones, while Jessica got handed her dream on a silver platter. Later, while Jessica was upstairs, I pulled Dad aside. "Is all of this really necessary?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "What do you mean?" he replied, feigning innocence. "You know exactly what I mean. Jessica's wedding is spiraling out of control. Live bands? Imported flowers? A venue that probably costs more than my yearly salary? Come on, Dad. This isn't normal." Dad sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mike, I know it's a lot, but it's her wedding. She's my only daughter. It's supposed to be special. And what about your retirement?" I shot back. "What about the money you've saved for the future? Are you really willing to risk all of that just to give her one over-the-top day? She deserves this, Dad said firmly, and I'll handle it. Don't worry about me. But I did worry. A few days later, Chris called me, his voice tight with anger. You're not going to believe this, he said. I overheard Dad on the phone with the bank. He's talking about refinancing the house. I felt my stomach drop. What? Yeah, Chris said bitterly. Apparently, the money he has saved isn't enough. He's actually thinking about taking out a loan to pay for the wedding. I rubbed my temples, trying to process what I was hearing. Our dad, the man who always preached about financial responsibility and living within your means, was now risking the house for a party. This is insane, I said. We need to do something. Chris and I decided to confront Dad together. The next weekend, we sat him down in the dining room, armed with facts and numbers. Chris had even consulted a financial advisor to back up our argument. Dad, you're putting everything at risk, Chris said. If you refinance the house and dip into your retirement savings, you're not just jeopardizing your future, you're jeopardizing Mom's too. Have you thought about that? Dad waved a hand dismissively. I'm not refinancing the house permanently. It's just a short-term solution. Once everything's settled, I'll pay it off. With what money? I asked, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. You're already stretched thin. This isn't just about the wedding, Dad. It's about the principle. You're going all out for Jessica while leaving Chris and me in the dust. That's not fair, Dad snapped. You boys have always been capable. You don't need my help. Chris clenched his fists. That's not the point. The point is, you're throwing money at Jessica like it's Monopoly cash, and the rest of us don't matter. It's insulting. Before Dad could respond, Jessica walked in, having clearly overheard everything. Wow, she said, crossing her arms. Jealous much? Are you serious right now? I asked, staring at her in disbelief. Jessica shrugged, her expression smug. It's not my fault Dad wants to give me the wedding I deserve. Maybe if you guys weren't so bitter, you'd see this is about family, not competition. Chris laughed bitterly. Family? Is that what you call it when one person gets everything, and the rest of us are expected to clap along like it's fair? Jessica's face turned red. You're just mad because you didn't get a big wedding. Newsflash, Chris. Maybe you should have asked for one. The argument spiraled from there, with Dad defending Jessica at every turn. I could see Mom sitting quietly in the corner, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say a word, but the tension in her expression spoke volumes. By the end of the night, nothing had been resolved. Chris left the house fuming, and I followed shortly after. The next day, I called Mom, hoping to get some clarity. She answered on the third ring, her voice tired. Mom, do you think any of this is okay? I asked. There was a long pause before she replied. I don't, she said softly. But what can I do, Mike? Your father won't listen to me. He never has when it comes to Jessica. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd assumed Mom was complicit in Dad's favoritism. But now, hearing the resignation in her voice, I realized she was just as stuck as Chris and I were. I'm sorry, Mom, I said. Don't be, she replied. I just hope your father sees reason before it's too late. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Dad wasn't about to change course. Jessica's wedding was full steam ahead, and nothing Chris or I said could stop it. All we could do was watch as the cracks in our family grew wider, threatening to break us apart entirely. The day of Jessica's wedding arrived, and it was exactly what I expected. An over-the-top spectacle that screamed excess. The venue was a historic estate in Charlottesville, complete with towering marble columns, manicured gardens, and a grand staircase that looked like it belonged in a movie. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a magazine, not in real life. I walked into the reception area, which was decked out with floral arrangements that probably cost as much as a small car. There were ice sculptures shaped like swans, a live band playing jazz, and servers in tuxedos offering trays of champagne. Every detail screamed extravagance, and all I could think about was how much money Dad had thrown into this. Chris wasn't there. True to his word, he'd refused to come, saying he couldn't stomach watching our dad bankrupt himself for Jessica's dream wedding. I didn't blame him, but I felt obligated to show up. Mom had called me the night before, practically begging me to come. "Please, Mike," she'd said. "If you don't come, it'll make everything worse." So there I was, standing in a room full of people, watching Jessica soak up the attention like a queen on her coronation day. She wore a custom-made dress flown in from Italy, with a train so long 2 bridesmaids had to carry it. She looked radiant, sure, but all I could see was the cost. The cost to Dad's finances, to our family, to everything that mattered. The ceremony itself went off without a hitch. Jessica and Brian exchanged vows in front of a floral arch while the band played softly in the background. Guests dabbed at their eyes with tissues, murmuring about how beautiful it all was. Even I had to admit it was a stunning event, but the resentment simmering beneath the surface made it impossible to enjoy. Things started unraveling during the reception. It began with the toasts. Dad got up to give his speech, holding a glass of champagne as he stood at the head of the room. "I just want to say how proud I am of my little girl," he began, his voice full of emotion. "Jessica, you've brought so much joy to our lives, and today is no exception. You deserve all the happiness in the world, and I'm honored to have helped make this day as special as you are." There was applause, but I noticed a few relatives exchanging uneasy glances. Dad went on, talking about all the sacrifices he'd made to give Jessica her dream wedding. He didn't say it outright, but his tone made it clear he was trying to justify the extravagant spending. Mom sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't clap when he finished, and the strained look on her face told me everything I needed to know. After the toasts, I decided to confront Dad. I caught him near the bar during a quieter moment, away from the crowd. "Can we talk?" I asked. He gave me a wary look but nodded. "What's on your mind? Do you even realize what you've done?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "You've sold property, dipped into your retirement, and refinanced the house for this wedding. Was it worth it?" Dad frowned, taking a sip of his drink. "It's not your concern, Mike. This was my choice." "It is my concern," I said, "because this isn't just about money. It's about the way you've treated us, me and Chris, like we don't matter. You've given Jessica everything, and now you've put yourself in financial jeopardy for one day." Dad's face hardened. "You don't understand, Mike. This is what a father does. He makes sacrifices for his children." "Really?" I shot back. "Because the only child you've made sacrifices for is Jessica. What about Chris? What about me? What do we get out of all this?" Before he could respond, Mom walked over. Her face was pale, but her eyes were determined. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling, "he's right. This has gone too far. I've kept quiet for years, but I can't do it anymore. You've put us all at risk, and for what? To give Jessica everything she's ever asked for?" Dad looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe she was siding with me. "Laura, not now," he said, glancing around the room. "Yes, now," Mom replied, her voice louder. "You've been so focused on Jessica that you've neglected the rest of this family. Mike and Chris deserve better than this." The argument was starting to draw attention. Relatives nearby turned to watch, their conversations falling silent. Then Jessica stormed over, her dress swishing dramatically as she approached. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "We're talking," I said. "No, you're ruining my wedding," Jessica snapped. Her face was flushed with anger. "Can't you just be happy for me for one day? Is that so hard?" "Happy?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. "Jessica, this isn't about your wedding. This is about the fact that Dad has put everything on the line for you, while the rest of us get ignored. Do you even care about what this is doing to the family?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but there was no vulnerability in her expression, just rage. "You're jealous," she said, her voice shaking. "That's all this is. You and Chris can't stand the fact that Dad loves me and wants me to be happy. Well, guess what? It's not my fault you two are bitter." Her fiancé, Brian, had been keeping his distance all night, but now he stepped in. "That's enough," he said, his tone firm but weary. "Jessica, calm down. And Mike, maybe this isn't the time." I shook my head, too angry to care about keeping the peace. "It's never the time, is it? Because we're all supposed to tiptoe around Jessica and pretend everything's fine while Dad destroys himself for her. The argument escalated from there, with voices growing louder and more relatives getting involved. At some point, the band stopped playing, and all eyes were on us. Jessica burst into tears and ran out of the room, followed by Brian, who looked like he was ready to collapse from exhaustion. Mom walked away too, tears streaming down her face. I grabbed my coat and left without saying goodbye. On the way out, I texted Chris, telling him what had happened. He wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed. "This family is broken," he said, "and it's Dad's fault." I couldn't disagree. The wedding might have been Jessica's big day, but for the rest of us, it marked the final nail in the coffin of a family already falling apart. The fallout from Jessica's wedding hit harder and faster than I'd anticipated. A week after the ceremony, I got a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer's office, formally notifying me that I'd been removed from Dad's will. Chris called me that same evening to say he'd received the same letter. "I can't believe he actually did it," Chris said, his voice cold. "Honestly, I can," I replied. "This is just the next step in the long list of terrible decisions he's made for Jessica's sake." Chris was quiet for a moment before saying, "I'm done, Mike. I'm not reaching out anymore. Not to Dad, not to Jessica. This whole thing isn't worth it." I didn't argue with him. If I were being honest, I felt the same way. The weeks that followed were filled with silence. Dad didn't call, and I didn't reach out either. Mom sent a few texts, mostly small talk, but it was clear she didn't know how to bridge the widening gap between us. Jessica, of course, acted like nothing had happened. She posted endless photos from the wedding on social media, tagging them with captions like, "The best day of my life," and "Family is everything." It was infuriating, but I refused to engage. Then, about a month after the wedding, I got an unexpected phone call from Jessica. "Mike," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know who else to talk to. What's going on?" I asked cautiously. She hesitated before blurting out, "Brian and I are having problems. He's threatening to move out if I don't stop relying on Dad for money." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. "And what do you want me to do about it?" "I don't know," she admitted. Do you think it's my fault?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Jessica, I think Brian's finally realizing what Chris and I have known for years. You've gotten so used to Dad bailing you out that you don't know how to stand on your own. And now it's affecting your marriage." She didn't respond right away, but I could hear her sniffling on the other end of the line. "Do you hate me?" she asked softly. I didn't answer right away. "No, I don't hate you. But I do resent the way you've treated me and Chris, like we're obstacles instead of family." The conversation ended awkwardly, with no resolution. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica's perfect world was starting to crack. Not long after that, I learned from one of my uncles that Dad had finally admitted to someone outside the immediate family that funding the wedding was a mistake. According to my uncle, Dad had confided that he was struggling to keep up with the financial strain but didn't know how to fix it. "He's too proud to admit it to you or Chris," my uncle told me. "But trust me, he knows he messed up." Hearing that should have felt like a small victory, but it didn't. Instead, it just made me angrier. Why couldn't Dad admit it to us? Why couldn't he take responsibility for what he'd done before things got this bad? Then came another blow. Mom called me one evening, her voice unusually quiet. "Mike," she said, "your dad sold another piece of property." "What?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "It wasn't a big one, just the old rental house in town," she explained. "But it was supposed to be part of your inheritance. He sold it to pay off some of the wedding debts." I closed my eyes, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Did he even tell you before he did it?" She sighed. "No, I only found out because the paperwork came in the mail. That was the final straw. I'd already lost my place in Dad's will, but now he was chipping away at the family's assets piece by piece, all to clean up the mess he'd made for Jessica's wedding. I decided to take a step back from everything. I stopped visiting Greenville and focused on my own life. Chris was thriving in Seattle, and his updates about his new job and fresh start made me realize how much happier he was now that he'd cut ties with the family drama. Mom called me a few times, trying to convince me to reconcile with Dad. "Mike," she said during one of these calls, "your dad regrets how things turned out. He just doesn't know how to say it." Then he needs to find a way, I told her. Because until he acknowledges what he's done, to me, to Chris, to this family, I can't move forward. The turning point came when my aunt organized a family meeting. She framed it as a way to clear the air, but I knew it was her way of forcing Dad, Jessica, and the rest of us to confront the elephant in the room. The meeting was tense from the start. Dad sat at the head of the table, looking defensive, while Jessica sat beside him, her arms crossed. Mom was quiet as usual, but her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. Chris joined via video call, his expression distant but resolute. The conversation started with Dad listing all the sacrifices he'd made for the family, trying to justify his decisions. Jessica chimed in, blaming everyone but herself and insisting that her wedding had been worth it. Chris finally cut in, his voice calm but firm. This isn't about the wedding anymore. It's about years of favoritism and the way it's torn this family apart. Until you can admit that, there's nothing left to say. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I laid everything out, the unequal treatment, the financial risks, the way Dad's actions had fractured our family. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Dad eventually offered a half-hearted apology, saying he'd made mistakes but still refusing to take full responsibility. Jessica doubled down, insisting she had nothing to apologize for. Chris logged off shortly after, saying, "Call me when you're ready to actually fix this." I stayed for a while longer, but it was clear that nothing was going to change. In the weeks that followed, things remained tense. Dad updated his will again, making vague promises about fairness, but I didn't hold my breath. Jessica's marriage continued to falter, with Brian temporarily moving out to clear his head. Mom tried to mediate, but even she seemed to realize that the damage was too deep to repair. As for me, I decided to focus on my own happiness. I started looking for opportunities to move further away, to put some real distance between myself and the chaos in Greenville. Chris and I stayed in touch, and his success reminded me that life could be better on the other side of all this. Our family might never heal, but I've made peace with that. At some point, you have to stop trying to fix what's broken and focus on building something new. For me, that means setting boundaries, protecting my peace, and letting go of the idea that we'll ever go back to the way things were. If Dad and Jessica want to live in their bubble, they're welcome to it. I'm done trying to make sense of their choices. From now on, I'm choosing my own path, one that doesn't involve being a spectator to their endless drama.